A black helicopter dropped out of the gray Georgia sky and settled onto the field behind a weathered farmhouse. And within seconds, half the town had spilled out onto their porches to watch. But only minutes earlier, inside that very house, a woman in a faded gray coat had been handed her suitcase and shoved toward the door by the family she had hoped to call her own, told she was nothing but a poor girl who had latched on to a good man to escape her own small life. Nobody standing in that yard, watching the rotor blades slow, understood that the woman clutching the handle of her suitcase was the chairwoman of a multi-billion-dollar aviation empire. When the cabin door finally swung open and a line of security agents stepped out and bowed their heads in unison, saying, "Good afternoon, Chairwoman Ashford," every insult that had been hurled at her in the last hour became a mistake that could never be undone. Rain had fallen off and on for most of the week leading up to the visit, leaving the fields around the small Georgia town soft and fragrant, the kind of autumn weather that made the whole county smell like wet earth and wood smoke. Malcolm Whitaker had been looking forward to this weekend for months. His parents were celebrating 40 years of marriage, and he wanted his wife standing beside him when he walked through the door of the house he grew up in. Imani had agreed without hesitation, though she asked for one small thing on the drive down from the airport, that she be allowed to arrive exactly as she was, without the trappings that usually followed her everywhere. She wore an old wool coat that had belonged to her mother, flat shoes with worn soles, and not a single piece of jewelry beyond a plain wedding band. She rented a battered pickup truck at the regional airport instead of calling for one of the company cars waiting on standby 2 states away. No assistant trailed behind her with a folder of documents. No driver idled at the curb. No security detail walked a discreet 10 paces, back the way it always did in the cities where people recognized her face. For one weekend, she wanted to be nothing more than Malcolm's wife, and she wanted, more than anything, to see his family, for who they truly were, before they ever learned who she was. The drive down from the airport had taken longer than expected, winding through back roads lined with pecan trees just beginning to turn, and Malcolm had spent most of it talking about his childhood, pointing out the pond where he learned to fish, and the church where his parents had married 4 decades earlier. Imani listened with genuine warmth, tucking away every detail the way she tucked away everything important to her, quietly and without fanfare. She had asked him, more than once over the years, what his family was like, and he had always answered the same way, calling them proud, old-fashioned, a little rough around the edges, but good at heart. She wanted badly to believe that description would hold up once she was standing in front of them, not as an idea he described, but as a flesh and blood woman they could measure and judge for themselves. The house smelled like cornbread and cedar smoke when they stepped inside, and for a moment Imani let herself enjoy it. The warmth of a home that had held 4 decades of laughter and arguments, and Sunday dinners. Malcolm's mother, Lucinda Whitaker, met them at the door with a smile that flickered the instant her eyes dropped from Imani's face to her shoes. His father, Jerome, shook Malcolm's hand with real affection, then turned to Imani with a polite but measuring look, the kind a man gives a stranger he isn't sure he wants in his house. Cedric, Malcolm's older brother, came down the hallway wiping his hands on a dish towel, and behind him trailed his wife Vanessa, dressed in a fitted red dress with gold hoops swinging at her ears, her eyes sweeping over Imani's coat and shoes, with a speed that suggested she had already reached a conclusion. A cousin, named Terence, leaned against the kitchen doorway, arms crossed, watching the whole scene with the mild amusement of a man who enjoyed other people's discomfort more than his own comfort. "It didn't take long for the questions to start," Vanessa asked, with a laugh that wasn't quite a laugh. Where exactly a person found a coat like that these days, and whether the discount store downtown still carried Imani's size. Lucinda glanced down at Imani's shoes and murmured that a woman ought to take better care of her appearance when meeting new family for the first time. Cedric, never one to let a silence sit too long, asked flatly what kind of work Imani did, and how much a person made doing whatever it was. Imani answered each question with the same even, unhurried smile, giving vague, honest fragments about working in aviation and spending most of her time traveling, never elaborating, never defending herself, never once raising her voice. Dinner itself was a slow procession of small cuts. Jerome asked whether Malcolm's new wife had ever worked a real job in her life, the kind that left a person tired enough to sleep without dreaming, and Imani answered that she had worked more hours in the last decade than most people worked in 3 lifetimes, though she said it so gently it slid past him without landing. Terence, seated at the far end of the table, entertained himself by asking whether she had ever flown first class, and when she said she had, he laughed and told the table that flying first class once didn't make a person special. Plenty of folks scraped together a ticket for a wedding or a funeral. Vanessa added that some people liked to dress plain on purpose, to seem humble, when really it was just another kind of performance, and she said it while looking directly at Imani's worn wool coat draped over the back of a kitchen chair. Malcolm's jaw tightened with every remark, but he held his tongue, hoping the evening would settle once everyone had a full stomach and a little wine in their glasses. It did not settle. By the time dinner was cleared, Vanessa leaned toward Lucinda and whispered, just loud enough for Imani to hear across the table, that their family had never before had someone marry in from so little, and Lucinda didn't disagree. The following morning, the family's true colors began to show themselves in smaller, more deliberate ways. Lucinda handed Imani a stack of dirty plates the moment she walked into the kitchen and told her that a good daughter-in-law learns her place quickly. Vanessa asked her to wash the breakfast dishes, then disappeared to paint her nails on the back porch, calling out over her shoulder that she trusted Imani to get the pots done properly, since she likely hadn't had much practice cooking anything worth eating. Cedric asked her to run to the market for coffee filters and heavy cream, as if she were staff rather than family, and handed her cash from his wallet, the way a man tips a delivery driver rather than asks a favor of someone he considers kin. Terence handed her 3 grocery bags to carry in from his truck without so much as a thank you, then settled onto the porch swing to watch her make 3 separate trips across the gravel driveway. By mid-morning, Lucinda had drawn up an entire list of chores and set it on the counter beside Imani, without a word of explanation, expecting it simply to be understood. Sweep the porch. Beat the rugs hanging over the back railing. Peel 2 pounds of potatoes for the evening meal. Fold the laundry drying on the line before the afternoon rain rolled in. Imani did every task without complaint, her expression calm, almost curious, the way a scientist studies a reaction unfolding exactly as predicted. She hummed quietly while she worked, and more than once caught Lucinda watching her from the kitchen window with an expression that flickered somewhere between satisfaction and confusion, as though the older woman had expected resistance and found none, and didn't quite know what to make of that. Malcolm watched from the doorway, his stomach twisting with each small humiliation, wondering how much more his wife would silently absorb before something inside her finally cracked. It was Vanessa who pushed hardest. During lunch, she reached across the table and, with a motion too smooth to be accidental, knocked over a full glass of sweet tea directly onto Imani's lap. The sound of gasps followed, and before Imani could even reach for a napkin, Vanessa was already turning to Lucinda with wide, innocent eyes, insisting that Imani had bumped the table herself. Lucinda tutted and said that a good wife learns to be patient with her husband's family, no matter what gets said or spilled. Cedric chuckled under his breath, not quite hiding it behind his napkin, and Terence offered a lazy remark about how some people just seemed to attract accidents wherever they went. Malcolm half rose from his seat, ready to say something sharp, but Imani touched his forearm lightly under the table, a silent signal that she wanted to handle this herself. Imani rose from the table, blotted the tea from her skirt with quiet composure, and said only that accidents happen. She excused herself to the bathroom to clean up, and through the thin wall she could hear Vanessa recounting an exaggerated version of the spill to Lucinda, embellishing details that had never actually occurred, painting herself as the gracious hostess dealing with a clumsy guest. Imani studied her own reflection in the mirror for a long moment, not with anger, but with the same careful attention she gave to reading a difficult clause buried inside a contract, filing away exactly what kind of family she had married into. That night, once the bedroom door was closed and the rest of the house had gone dark, Malcolm apologized to his wife for the 10th time that day, his voice thick with frustration and shame. He told her he hadn't expected his family to behave this way, that they had always been proud and set in their opinions but never openly cruel, Not like this. Not to someone he loved. He offered to pack their bags in the morning and drive back to the airport early, to spare her another day of small humiliations dressed up as hospitality. Imani sat on the edge of the bed, took his hand, and told him gently that she needed to see exactly who these people were when they believed she had nothing to offer them. She reminded him, in the same quiet voice she used when explaining complicated things to nervous new board members, that she had built her entire company on the ability to read people accurately, to know within the first few minutes of a negotiation who could be trusted and who was only performing trust until the moment it became inconvenient. She wanted to know, honestly, whether his family's warmth toward him would extend to a stranger who arrived with nothing but a suitcase and a wedding ring, or whether their affection had quiet conditions attached that nobody had ever bothered to name out loud. Malcolm didn't understand what she meant by that. Not fully, not yet, but something in her calm certainty made him trust that she had a reason. The same trust that had carried him through 8 years of a marriage, built on more patience and mystery than most men would have tolerated. 2 states away, inside the glass tower that housed the headquarters of Ashford Global Aviation, the executive floor had grown tense over the course of the afternoon. The board of directors had gathered for a scheduled meeting concerning a multi-billion-dollar contract with an overseas logistics partner, a deal that only the chairwoman herself was authorized to finalize. Her chair at the head of the table sat empty. Her chief of staff, a sharp and unflappable woman named Renata Doyle, fielded a dozen anxious questions with the same measured answer each time. The chairwoman was on personal leave and could not be reached through ordinary channels. Shareholders began calling within the hour, their voices sharp with worry over a deal that had taken the better part of a year to negotiate. Lawyers began pacing the long hallway outside the boardroom, murmuring about penalty clauses and expiration windows written into the contract's fine print. The chief financial officer, a cautious man who rarely spoke above a measured tone, suggested in a low and worried voice that perhaps someone should attempt to locate the chairwoman directly, given the size and the urgency of the contract sitting untouched on the table. Renata had fielded these kinds of moments before, and she understood better than anyone in that room exactly why Imani had chosen this particular weekend, of all weekends, to vanish so completely. Still, business was business, and a deal of this size waited for no one, not even the woman who had built the company from nothing more than 2 second-hand cargo planes and a loan she'd nearly been denied 12 years earlier. Renata excused herself from the room, walked to the far end of the executive floor where the windows overlooked the city, and dialed a private line that only a handful of people in the company had ever used. Within the hour, a helicopter crew at the regional hangar had been given coordinates for a small town in Georgia, along with strict instructions to proceed with discretion and to make contact only once they had confirmed the chairwoman's exact location. Nobody in that farmhouse, laughing over coffee and passing judgment on a stranger's coat, had any idea that the machinery of a multi-billion-dollar company had just quietly begun turning in their direction. By the second afternoon, the family had decided they had seen enough. Vanessa came storming into the living room, holding an empty velvet box, declaring that her grandmother's pearl necklace was missing from the dresser drawer where she always kept it, and that the only person who had been alone in that room all morning was Imani. Her voice climbed with practiced outrage, each word aimed less at recovering the necklace than at finally justifying 2 days of quiet resentment. Cedric immediately backed his wife's story, saying he had noticed Imani lingering near the bedroom earlier that day, though he had noticed no such thing, and the ease with which the lie left his mouth suggested he had been waiting for an excuse just as much as Vanessa had. Jerome's face darkened, and he didn't ask a single question before deciding the accusation was true. His years of quiet suspicion toward the daughter-in-law he barely knew, finally finding somewhere to land. Nobody suggested checking the security camera mounted above the porch, the one Jerome had installed himself 2 years earlier after a string of break-ins in the neighborhood, its small lens angled just enough to catch a sliver of the upstairs hallway through the window. Nobody considered that Vanessa herself had worn a nearly identical strand of pearls to dinner the night before, tucked casually back into her own jewelry box before anyone thought to compare the two. Malcolm tried to interject, pointing out that his wife had spent the entire morning in the kitchen peeling potatoes exactly as instructed, never once out of anyone's sight for longer than it took to use the bathroom down the hall. His objection dissolved into the noise of the room, drowned beneath Lucinda's rising voice, and Vanessa's continued insistence that she knew what she knew. Lucinda's anger arrived like a summer storm, sudden and total. She marched into the guest room, pulled Imani's suitcase from beside the bed, and dragged it down the hallway toward the front door, her voice rising with every step. She told Imani that this house had no room for people who came in from nothing and tried to take what didn't belong to them. Malcolm rushed forward, insisting his wife would never steal anything from anyone, but Jerome's hand shot out and gripped his son's shoulder, telling him firmly to be quiet and let the grown folks handle the situation. Imani stood in the hallway without a single word of protest. She reached for the suitcase Lucinda had thrown at her feet, straightened her coat, and walked toward the front door with a steadiness that unsettled everyone watching her, though none of them could have said exactly why. The front door had barely clicked shut behind her when a low rumble began building somewhere over the tree line, faint at first, then unmistakable, growing, until windows across 3 neighboring houses began to rattle in their frames. Neighbors stepped out onto porches, hands shading their eyes against the afternoon sun, staring up as a sleek black helicopter cut across the sky and began its slow descent toward the open field behind the Whitaker property. A man 2 doors down dropped the hose he'd been using to wash his truck. A pair of teenagers on bicycles skidded to a stop at the corner, craning their necks toward the sound. Dust and loose grass kicked up in a wide circle as the aircraft touched down, its engine winding into a lower, steadier hum, the rotor blades slowing until their individual shapes became visible again, against the pale afternoon sky. 2 black SUVs that had been trailing the property on a back road for the last 20 minutes turned in through the gate and rolled to a stop near the fence line. Doors opened in near-perfect unison. Security agents in dark suits stepped out first, forming a loose perimeter with practiced ease, their eyes sweeping the yard, the road, the porch, cataloging every detail out of pure habit, rather than any real concern. Behind them came a small group of executives whose faces the Whitaker family had certainly seen before in business magazines and evening news segments, though never standing on their own patch of grass, never close enough to touch. Jerome, still standing near the porch steps with his hand raised toward the road, slowly lowered his arm, his eyes darting between the aircraft and the woman he had just watched walk out of his house with nothing but a suitcase and her dignity. A tall man, in a charcoal suit, stepped forward from the group, his eyes scanning the yard until they found the woman standing near the porch steps with a suitcase in her hand. He was the chief executive officer of Ashford Global Aviation, and beside him walked the company's general counsel, its chief operating officer, and the head of corporate security, each of them falling into step behind him as he crossed the lawn. When he reached Imani, he stopped, straightened his jacket, and bowed his head with genuine, practiced respect, his voice carrying easily across the suddenly silent yard as he said, "Good afternoon, Chairwoman Ashford." Every agent behind him echoed the greeting a half-second later, a chorus of quiet deference that hit the Whitaker family like a wave of cold water. Vanessa's mouth fell open mid-sentence. Cedric's empty velvet box slipped from his fingers and landed soundlessly in the grass. Jerome stood frozen on the porch steps, his hand still hovering in the air, where he had been pointing toward the road only seconds before. Malcolm turned slowly toward his wife, his expression caught somewhere between disbelief and dawning understanding, as if pieces of a puzzle he never knew he was holding had just clicked violently into place. The chief executive, a composed man named Douglas Everhart, wasted no time on pleasantries once the initial shock had settled over the yard. He explained, in the calm tone of someone accustomed to briefing rooms full of anxious investors, that Imani Ashford was the co-founder and chairwoman of Ashford Global Aviation, one of the largest privately held logistics and aviation companies in the country, with contracts spanning 4 continents and a fleet that included the very helicopter now resting in the field behind them. He described how she had started the company alongside a business partner more than a decade earlier, working out of a rented hangar with 2 second-hand cargo planes and a handful of loyal employees who believed in her vision long before any bank was willing to extend her credit. He spoke of the years she had spent building relationships with shipping partners across the world, flying coach on red-eye flights to close deals that competitors twice her size had dismissed as impossible, and of the sleepless months when the entire company had nearly collapsed under the weight of a single failed contract before she found a way to save it. He mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that she also chaired a private foundation that had funded scholarship programs, medical clinics, and disaster relief efforts in communities across the South for more than a decade, quietly, without press coverage, exactly the way she preferred to do things. Her personal fortune, he added, ran into the tens of billions, though she rarely discussed numbers even with her own board, and had once told her executive team, half joking, that a number that large stopped meaning anything useful the moment it became the only thing people saw when they looked at her. He recalled a moment from years earlier, when a journalist had pressed her repeatedly for an exact figure during a rare interview, and she had simply smiled and said that the only number she cared about counting was the number of people her company had managed to keep employed through difficult years, a response that never made it into the final published piece, but had stuck with everyone in the room who heard it firsthand. The general counsel standing beside him added quietly that the contract awaiting her signature back in New York represented one of the largest logistics partnerships the company had ever negotiated, and that the entire deal had been placed on hold for nearly 2 full days while the firm searched for her, unwilling to move forward without the one signature that mattered. Malcolm stood absolutely still through all of it, his mind struggling to reconcile the woman he had married with the figure being described. He had known, of course, that Imani made investments, that she disappeared for stretches of work he never asked too many questions about, that she carried herself with a confidence most people took years to earn. But he had never imagined the scale of what she had built, or that she had chosen, deliberately and for reasons of her own, never to tell him the full truth of it. When he finally found his voice, he asked her quietly why she had never said anything, and Imani turned to him with the same patient calm she had worn through every insult of the last 2 days, explaining that she had wanted, just once, to be loved and judged for exactly who she was, rather than for anything her name or her money could provide. Malcolm nodded slowly, understanding settling over him like a weight he hadn't realized he was ready to carry. Lucinda was the first to break down. She sank onto the porch steps, her hands pressed over her mouth, tears cutting clean lines through the powder on her cheeks as the full weight of what she had just done crashed over her. Jerome descended the steps on unsteady legs and began apologizing before he had even reached the bottom, his voice cracking, as he admitted he had let pride and assumption guide every judgment he'd made about her since the moment she walked through his door. Vanessa dropped to her knees right there in the grass, sobbing that she never meant for things to go as far as they had, that jealousy had gotten the better of her, though nobody in the yard was entirely convinced that was the whole truth. She admitted, between broken breaths, that she had spent years feeling invisible inside this family, overshadowed by Cedric's steady job and Malcolm's education, and that seeing a woman who seemed to have even less than she did walk in and receive Malcolm's quiet devotion had struck a nerve she hadn't known was still raw. It wasn't an excuse, she said, just the truth, and she understood if Imani never wanted to look at her again after everything she'd done over the last 2 days. Cedric extended a trembling hand toward Imani, attempting some clumsy version of a handshake, while Terence hung back near the fence, muttering that the whole family had clearly misunderstood the situation from the very beginning. Imani looked around at each of them slowly, taking in every tear, every stammered apology, before asking one simple, devastating question. If she had truly been exactly as poor as they assumed, would any of this remorse exist at all? Would Lucinda have chased her down the driveway with an apology if there had been no helicopter waiting in the field, no executives bowing their heads, nothing but a woman in a worn coat walking away with a suitcase and a broken heart? Would Cedric have offered his hand so quickly, or Vanessa dropped to her knees so fast, if the only consequence of their cruelty had been a quiet, private grief that nobody outside that house would ever witness? Nobody answered her. The silence that followed stretched long enough that even the birds in the nearby trees seemed to have gone quiet out of respect for it, and in that silence, every member of the family was forced to sit with the uncomfortable possibility that their remorse had less to do with what they had done, and more to do with what it had cost them once the truth came out. Imani did not raise her voice or demand an apology be repeated. She did not call for anyone to be fired, though two of her executives quietly offered to review Cedric's small business loan, which happened to run through a bank her company partly owned, as if searching for some way to punish him through the machinery available to them. She refused that suggestion outright. She did not threaten legal action over the false accusation of theft, though her general counsel stood ready to draft whatever letter she wanted the moment she asked. She did not humiliate the family further by staying to enjoy their discomfort, nor did she leave without a word, simply vanishing into the helicopter to let them stew in their shame. Instead, she said only one thing, quietly, to the group still gathered on the lawn, that money had never once been what determined the shape of a person's character. Douglas Everhart and the rest of the executive team stood quietly by the vehicles, giving the family the space to work through what had just unfolded, though their presence alone was a constant reminder of exactly how much had been at stake the moment Lucinda threw that suitcase toward the road. Renata Doyle, who had flown down personally rather than send someone else, approached Imani with a tablet in hand, murmuring something about the contract still awaiting signature and asking, delicately, whether she preferred to review it now or once they returned to the city. Imani glanced at the screen for only a moment before nodding and signing with a practiced motion, as effortless as breathing, a stark contrast to the woman who had spent the last 2 days scrubbing pots and peeling potatoes without complaint. Malcolm crossed the grass and took her hand, holding it the way a man holds, something he has only just realized he could have lost, and in that moment he understood, more clearly than he ever had in 8 years of marriage, that his wife's greatest wealth had nothing to do with the numbers in any account. It lived instead in the steadiness with which she had absorbed every insult without becoming bitter, and in the grace with which she now refused to return cruelty for cruelty, even when she had every resource in the world to do so. Jerome asked, once he had gathered himself enough to speak clearly, whether there was anything at all he could do to make amends for the way he had treated her from the moment she stepped through his front door. He confessed, his voice low and heavy with something that sounded like real shame, that he had spent his whole life measuring people by the car they drove or the job title stitched into casual conversation, and that he had never once stopped to consider how much that habit had cost him in the people he'd misjudged along the way. He told her about his own father, a sharecropper who had been dismissed and disrespected his entire life by men who assumed his worth ended at the color of his skin and the calluses on his hands, and how he had sworn, "Asa boy," that he would never let anyone look down on his own family the way strangers had looked down on his. Somewhere along the way, he admitted, that vow had curdled into something uglier, a need to prove his own family's worth by measuring everyone who walked through his door, and he had never once noticed the irony of doing to Imani exactly what had been done to his father. Lucinda, still seated on the porch steps, admitted through her tears that she had taught her sons the same careless habit without ever meaning to, passing down a kind of quiet cruelty disguised as practicality. She said she had grown up believing that a full pantry and a paid-off house were the only proof a person needed of their own worth, and that anyone who arrived at her door without those things automatically became someone to manage rather than someone to welcome. She reached for Imani's hand, hesitated, then pulled her own back, unsure if she had any right to touch her after everything that had been said over the last 2 days. Vanessa announced, unprompted, that she intended to resign from her position at the small marketing firm her own family had helped her land years earlier, saying she needed to build something of her own before she could ever claim to understand what it meant to be judged for nothing but her worth as a person. Cedric, still pale from the shock of the afternoon, said he planned to sell the luxury sedan parked in the driveway, the one he had spent the better part of 2 years bragging about to anyone who would listen, and start over with something more honest to his actual means. Imani listened to each of them, without offering forgiveness outright, and without offering any promise of help either. She told them only that if they truly wanted to be respected, they would need to learn how to extend respect first, to strangers and family alike, long before they ever knew what that person could offer them in return. In the weeks that followed the helicopter's departure, Malcolm found himself calling his parents less out of obligation and more out of a genuine curiosity to see whether the promises made on that lawn would hold under the weight of ordinary days once the shock had faded. Jerome answered every call sounding more subdued than Malcolm had ever known him to be, asking careful questions about Imani's schedule, her health, whether she had eaten enough that week, small questions that added up to something that looked almost like real concern. Lucinda sent a handwritten letter within the first month, apologizing again on paper for every chore she had assigned and every insult she had allowed to pass unchecked at her own table. Admitting that she had spent 40 years building a home, she was suddenly ashamed of the way she had run it. Vanessa's silence lasted longer than anyone else's, nearly 6 weeks, before a short message arrived asking whether Imani might be willing to speak with her sometime, not for money or favors, but simply to understand how a person survived humiliation without turning bitter afterward. A full year passed before Malcolm and Imani returned to that same house for another family gathering, and the town noticed the difference almost as quickly as the family did. Jerome had taken to volunteering 2 mornings a week at the community center downtown, working alongside people whose stories he once would have dismissed without a second thought, learning names and listening to hardships he might once have judged from a comfortable distance. Neighbors who had known him for 30 years remarked that he seemed lighter somehow, quicker to laugh, slower to assume the worst about a stranger's circumstances. Lucinda had started a small program out of her kitchen, teaching cooking classes to teenagers from the housing complex on the edge of town, refusing to charge a single one of them a dime, insisting instead that the only payment she wanted was for each of them to teach the recipes to someone else one day. Vanessa had left the marketing firm behind entirely and was 2 semesters into a business degree, working nights at a diner to cover her own rent for the first time in her adult life, a fact she mentioned to Imani with something closer to pride than embarrassment during one of their occasional phone calls. Cedric had sold the luxury sedan, just as he'd promised, and now drove a modest truck that he'd paid for outright with money he had actually saved, telling anyone who asked that he slept better at night without a car payment hanging over his head like a debt to his own image. Terence, who had said the least during the whole ordeal, had quietly begun mentoring young men in the neighborhood who had nobody else steady in their lives, a fact he never once brought up himself, though Malcolm heard about it secondhand from an old high school friend who still lived in town and thought Malcolm ought to know. When Imani and Malcolm walked through the front door that second time, nobody glanced down at her shoes. Nobody asked what she did for a living or how much money it brought in. Jerome was the first to cross the room, wrapping his arms around his daughter-in-law before either of them had said a single word, holding on a beat longer than a simple greeting required, as though trying to make up in one embrace for everything he had failed to offer a year earlier. Lucinda followed close behind him, insisting on preparing the entire dinner herself that night, refusing any help from anyone in the kitchen, moving between the stove and the counter with the focused determination of a woman trying to cook her way back into someone's good graces. Cedric shook Malcolm's hand, and then, almost shyly, extended the same to Imani, telling her he'd finally paid off the truck he now drove, and that it felt better owning something outright than it ever had, leasing something meant to impress people he barely knew. Vanessa pulled Imani aside during a quiet moment after the meal and thanked her, plainly and without pretense, for choosing mercy over ruin in a moment when she'd had every resource in the world to destroy her instead. She mentioned the diner, the late nights studying at the kitchen table after her shifts ended, and how strange it felt to build something slowly, instead of simply being handed comfort by other people's money. The conversation lasted only a few minutes, but something in it settled a debt that no apology alone could have paid. Late that evening, the same black helicopter that had once frozen an entire yard in stunned silence touched down again in the same field behind the house, its rotor blades slicing through the cool autumn air, exactly as they had 1 year before. This time, though, no security agents rushed forward, and no executive stepped out with contracts or explanations. There was only a pilot waiting patiently by the open door, ready to carry Malcolm and Imani home after a weekend that had, at long last, become what every family gathering was supposed to be from the very beginning. As the aircraft lifted off the ground, and the farmhouse shrank beneath them into a small, warm square of light, Imani rested her head against her husband's shoulder and thought about how far a single year could carry a family, if only they were willing to look honestly at themselves and choose to change what they found. She thought of Jerome kneeling in the wet grass a year earlier, of Lucinda's shaking hands as she tore the letter she'd first drafted and started over with softer words, of Vanessa sitting across from her at a small diner months ago, asking questions with none of the old performance in her voice. None of it erased what had happened on that porch. None of it needed to. Growth, Imani had come to believe, was never about erasing the past but about proving, slowly and consistently, that a person had become someone different from who they used to be. A person's worth was never written in the car they drove, the clothes they wore, or the balance sitting quietly in some distant account. It lived instead in how they treated the people who could offer them nothing in return, and in whether they chose forgiveness over cruelty when the power to punish sat easily within their reach. Imani had learned that lesson long before she ever became a chairwoman, back when she herself had nothing but a duffel bag and a stubborn refusal to let anyone's judgment define what she believed she was capable of building. Malcolm squeezed her hand as the lights of the small Georgia town faded into the dark beneath them, and he found himself thinking, not for the first time that weekend, that he had married a woman whose greatest fortune had never been the one written on any balance sheet. It was the quiet, unshakable steadiness she carried into every room, the kind that could survive being thrown out of a house with nothing but a suitcase, and still choose, when the moment came, to answer cruelty with grace instead of ruin. On that quiet flight home, watching the last lights of the town disappear into the darkness below, she finally allowed herself to believe that the family she had married into had learned that lesson too, and that whatever came next, they would carry it with them, not because a helicopter had once landed in their field, but because they had chosen, on their own, to become people worth landing beside.